Okay, so you'll be sitting here. So The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 4, the chair announces that the chair may postpone further proceedings on approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous material on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intended to consider today's measures and amendments en bloc. Pursuant to notice for purposes of markup, I will now call up the en bloc passage consisting of 7 measures. First, H.Res. 543, recognizing Hong Kong's bilateral relationship with the U.S. with an amendment in the nature of a substitute. 2, H.R. 3289, Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 4270, Protect Hong Kong Act, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.Res. 517, supporting the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, malaria, and its Sixth Replenishment. H.Res. 387, condemning continued violence against civilians by armed groups in the Central American Republic, with an Engel amendment. H.Res. 552, calling on the government of the Russian Federation to release Paul Whelan. And finally, H.Res. 521, which commends the Canadian government for their efforts in extracting a Huawei executive. At this time, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. I'm pleased to support all of the measures before us today, and I thank our members for their hard work. I want to start by discussing our strong measures that address the situation in Hong Kong. Over the past months, we've watched as the people of Hong Kong have bravely and tirelessly protested for their rights and their freedoms, and we are watching in real time as Beijing tries to flex its muscles and stifle this democratic dissent. 30 years after Tiananmen Square massacre, Chinese authorities are still trying to use violence and intimidation to crush fundamental freedoms. To the Chinese Communist Party and those seeking to undermine Hong Kong's freedom and autonomy, let me be crystal clear, the House Foreign Affairs Committee will not just sit idly by. So I'm pleased we have a number of good measures before us today to demonstrate our support for the Hong Kong people at this critical time. Firstly, we have Mr. Smith's Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which requires regular evaluations of Beijing's aggressive attempts to interfere in Hong Kong's society. We also have Mr. Sherman's resolution that condemns China's intrusions in Hong Kong's affairs and supports the people of Hong Kong's right to protest. And there's Mr. McGovern's Protect Hong Kong Act, which addresses the disturbingly excessive use of force by the Hong Kong police against protesters. This bipartisan bill ensures that U.S. weapons aren't being used to contribute to these horrific abuses. All 3 of these measures are important ways for us to take a stand on these critical issues, and I'm pleased to support them all. Another measure on China today is Mr. McCall's H.Res. 521. China has essentially been playing a game of hostage diplomacy with our ally and neighbor Canada, arresting and detaining Canadian citizens purely to retaliate against Canada's lawfully arresting a Huawei executive. This measure rightly shows our support for Canada, upholding the rule of law, and expresses concern over this dangerous and inappropriate response from the Chinese government. Next, we have a measure dealing with an American citizen being wrongfully held in prison abroad. Russia's Vladimir Putin and his cronies have kept American Paul Whelan locked up for over 8 months without providing so much as a shred of evidence that he's done anything wrong. H.Res. 552 calls on the Russian government to provide evidence or release Mr. Whelan so he can come home to the United States and receive the proper medical treatment he so urgently needs. Every day he spends in that Russian prison is yet another day spent suffering. This is another reminder of the kind of leader Putin is, and something we should all keep in mind. I strongly support this measure, and I want to thank Representative Stevens for his hard work to seek justice for Paul Whelan and his family. Next, I'll turn to my resolution with Mr. McCall that demonstrates Congress' bipartisan support for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The Global Fund has contributed to incredible achievements in the fight against some of the world's most terrible diseases. We cannot accept the Trump administration's drastic cut to this life-saving program, so I'm pleased We are moving this forward and hope all members will join me in supporting it. Finally, we turn to the Central African Republic, where there are over 1 million people displaced by horrific violence and instability. Mr. Cicilline and Mr. Fortenberry's resolution before us today condemns the rampant violence of armed groups in the Central African Republic and supports the country's efforts to move towards stability and accountability. It's a good measure that shows we are paying attention to this critical issue, and I hope all members will join me in supporting it. Again, I am pleased to support all of the measures on today's markup, and I urge all members on both sides to join me in doing so. And I'll now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you again for your bipartisanship. I was on the floor yesterday with Congressman Levin debating 6 bills that we passed on suspension, dealing with human rights in Burma and genocide, and it just makes me proud to be a part of this committee. And today, we're going to mark up 2 bipartisan bills and 5 bipartisan resolutions. And I want to start by thanking you, Chairman Engel, for your work on House Resolution 517, supporting the Global Fund, which I'm proud to be the lead Republican on this effort. It's vitally important, as you mentioned, the cuts were unacceptable. I think you and I standing together to fully fund this Global Health Fund. Right now in the United Nations, the Assembly is in New York right now, and there will be a Global Health Conference in Lyon, France in October. I think this important piece of legislation will send a strong message to the world that we intend to fully fund it, and we also want full participation from other countries. Today we will consider 3 very important Hong Kong measures. Last week I was proud to have joined Speaker Pelosi and you, sir, Mr. Engel, Congressman Smith, the author of the bill, and Jim McGovern, and several Hong Kong pro-democracy activists to denounce China's authoritarian brutality. I said it then, I'll say it again. Today, we stand not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans united in our strong support for Hong Kong. And as I said at the press conference directly to the people of Hong Kong, America stands with you, and we will always support you. We hear you sing our national anthem, and we see you carrying our American flag. This is a battle between democracy versus dictatorship, liberty versus tyranny, and freedom versus oppression. I'm pleased that today we will consider Mr. Smith's Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which sends a clear message to China that there will be consequences to their ruthless and brutal actions. This committee, this Congress, and the United States and the world will not stand by idly as the Chinese Communist Party fights for itself and not its own people. I know we read many reports coming out of China after our press conference, and I'm sure we'll hear many today. I wear that as a badge of honor. I would also like to highlight House Resolution 521, which I introduced with my good friend Chairman Engel. This resolution commends Canada for upholding the rule of law regarding the extradition of Huawei Technologies Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou. It also expresses concern with China's retaliatory and hostile actions against Canadian citizens detained in China. China's hostage diplomacy is abhorrent. Canadian citizens Michael Kovreg and Michael Spavor have been detained in China since last year without due process and have been subjected to harsh conditions such as limited consular access, no attorney representation, and lengthy interrogations. Meanwhile, Ms. Meng, on the other hand, has received proper treatment in Canadian custody with all of her legal, health, and other needs attended to, and is currently released on bail. What a difference in the 2 criminal justice systems. I commend Canada and regret that the Canadian citizens are paying the price of China's malfeasance. Canadian citizens must be released immediately. Finally, we all need to remember that Huawei is supported by the Chinese government and is responsive to its leaders. Our data is not safe or secure on their systems. And I appreciate Australia, and I was at the embassy last weekend with the Prime Minister and other countries who have pushed back against Huawei. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to supporting you and these measures today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Mr. Sherman.
I'm pleased that the chair and ranking member have guided us here to a group of legislation that we can all be proud of. I'm pleased to co-sponsor all the bills under consideration. And once again, this committee sets a standard for bipartisanship. Particularly want to focus on the Stand with Hong Kong resolution, which I introduced along with Ms. Wagner, Mr. Conley, Mr. Yoho, and of course we have other co-sponsors as well. This demonstrates that the so-called extradition bill is an infringement on the rights, the autonomy rights of Hong Kong, and that we stand with the protesters and their 5 demands: a complete withdrawal of this extradition bill, the implementation of universal suffrage, and the election of a chief executive and all members of the Legislative Council, the establishment of an independent commission to investigate police conduct during the protests, the declassification of the protesters as rioters, and the dropping of all charges against persons who participated in the protests. We are also considering, and I'm pleased to co-sponsor, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and the Protect Hong Kong Act. I join with Mr. Cicilline in his concern for what is happening in the Central African Republic. I commend the chairman for his resolution regarding our commitment to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And of course, we need to call for the proper handling of the complaint against an American citizen, Paul Whelan, who is being held by Russia and with Russia not as of yet producing charges or credible evidence. And of course, Canada is to be commended for its steadfast adherence to its obligations under the extradition treaty with the United States in connection with the chief financial officer of Huawei. Unfortunately, Canadian nationals are being held in response. We need to make it plain to China that it's very hard to do business when they engage in hostage diplomacy. So I urge a yes vote on all bills, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, as you and Ranking Member McCall and other members of this committee know so well, the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration that facilitated the conveyance of Hong Kong from the UK to the PRC beginning July 1st, 1997, was absolutely clear that autonomy, human rights, including press, assembly, association, and religion, would be exactly the same as before the handover for at least 50 years, and that would take them to the year 2047. The basic law of Hong Kong, adopted by China's National People's Congress in 1990, was also clear that autonomy and rights would be protected, again, with no diminution whatsoever of that autonomy and rights until 2047. Today, however, those promises solemnly undertaken by Beijing have seriously eroded, and as stated in the most recent State Department report, they have been diminished. Since that report, however, things have gotten demonstrably worse. So I would like to thank, on a daily basis, we are reminded of the desire of the brave people of Hong Kong to be free, and how the totalitarian regime of Xi Jinping is working to dismantle the rights and liberties of the people of Hong Kong. So I'd like to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall and their staff for working diligently with my staff and with the lead Democratic co-sponsor, Jim McGovern, and the Speaker's staff to bring the Hong Kong Human Rights Democracy and Democracy Act to Markup. This legislation is timely and it is essential. 5 years ago, I first introduced the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, co-sponsored by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and then on the Senate side with co-chair of the China Commission, Senator Sherrod Brown. The bill allowed for more flexible and robust U.S. responses to the steady erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy and human rights. Over the years, we've upgraded the bill. This is the fourth time we've introduced it. But again, this comes at the most critical time. Look how many people are out on the streets. Joshua Wong at the press conference last week, and he said it in a Washington Post article back in June, that at one point there were 2 million people on the streets. That's 1/4 of the entire population of Hong Kong. So again, I want to thank my good friends and colleagues for co-sponsoring, including many members of this committee. Specifically, the bill directs the Secretary of State to certify to Congress annually whether Hong Kong continues to deserve special treatment under U.S. law, different from mainland China, in such matters as trade, customs, sanctions enforcement, law enforcement cooperation, and protection of human rights and the rule of law. It also underscores the need for the State Department not to deny entry visas based on the applicant's arrest or detention for participating in nonviolent protest activities in Hong Kong. It requires an annual report on whether the Hong Kong government adequately enforces U.S. export controls and sanctions laws, requires the Secretary of State to submit a strategy to Congress to protect U.S. citizens and businesses in Hong Kong from erosion of autonomy and the rule of law because of actions taken by the Chinese Communist government, especially in Beijing. It requires the President to identify and sanction persons in Hong Kong or in mainland China responsible for the erosion of human rights and Hong Kong's autonomy. The particular amendment in the nature of a substitute further directs the State Department to provide greater analysis of the threats to Hong Kong's autonomy and extend the period of reporting. By requiring certification by the Secretary of State, it helps to ensure an honest evaluation of the situation as it really is on the ground, much as our annual trafficking in persons tier rankings are intended to do. And it contains a waiver provision agreed to by both sides of the aisle to ensure that our actions enhance the autonomy of Hong Kong rather than inadvertently harming it. I'd also like to urge passage of Chairman McGovern's Protect Hong Kong Act, which I am the lead Republican co-sponsor. Congressman McGovern and I were first members of Congress to call on the Trump administration to suspend the sale of tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray, and other crowd control equipment to the Hong Kong police. In tandem with the Hong Kong's Human Rights Democracy and Act, Congress is sending a clear bipartisan and bicameral statement, and I do urge support for this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleague, Representative Cicilline, for introducing House Reg 387. I am discouraged by the continuing violence between rival armed groups in the Central African Republic that has caused fatalities and injuries to innocent citizens and peacekeepers. The recent clashes between the Popular Front for the Renaissance of the Central African Republic and the movement of the Central African Freedom Fighters for Justice is direct conflict of the peace deal signed by 14 armed groups in February of this year. I'm concerned about the effectiveness of ending the violence that has plagued the country since the removal of the former president, Bosisi, in 2013. Furthermore, this unrelenting conflict has forced millions of Kars residents to migrate to neighboring countries, fleeing their homes and livelihoods. I also condemn the violence against innocent civilians and humanitarian workers, and I call on the international community to help find long-term sustainable solutions that will help stabilize the region. CAR has made progress toward democracy, justice, and accountability by holding democratic elections in 2016 and by establishing the Special Criminal Court and peace committees in 2017. Since 2013, the U.S. has been the largest single donor to the humanitarian response in CAR and has remained involved in peace throughout the country, in promoting peace throughout the country. This measure resolves that the U.S. must maintain strong leadership and support in CAR to ensure regional security and stability. The resolution condemns violence committed by all armed actors within CAR. What is very important about this resolution is that it calls for coordination between U.S. agencies in providing assistance and for the U.S. Embassy in Bangui to have adequate staff and funding. This is critical for supporting this partnership with the Central African Republic. I also want to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for introducing House Reg 517. This resolution outlines the value of the Global Fund's contribution to fighting AIDS, malaria, and TB highlights the historical U.S. leadership role with the Global Fund and references the upcoming replenishment and contributions by other countries to date. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on Hong Kong and on the three related measures we have before us today, and I'll be relatively brief, namely the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, authored by Mr. Smith, Mr. McGovern's Protect Hong Kong Act, and Mr. Sherman's resolution on the protests. All of them I'm supportive and thank them for offering these and thank them for their leadership. Over the past several months, we've watched as the people of Hong Kong have bravely stood up to the Chinese Communist Party, demanding that Hong Kong authorities withdraw the extradition bill that would have further eroded Hong Kong's autonomy. When Britain handed Hong Kong back to the Chinese Communist Party, Hong Kong was guaranteed basic human rights, basic freedoms, along with a substantial degree of autonomy. The Chinese Communist Party proceeded to break all those promises, not surprisingly, like most of the other promises that they've broken over time. True to form, they've worked to steadily erode Hong Kong's independence, and the extradition bill was only the last straw for the people of Hong Kong, who have no desire to live under the yoke of the PRC, where dissent is a crime and basic human rights ignored. After months of delay, Beijing ultimately let Hong Kong's leadership withdraw the extradition bill, but not before the people of Hong Kong became determined to not only defeat the bill, but also to win back some of their long-lost freedoms. As protests continue, and as we approach October 1st, the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's bloody rule, the jury's still out on whether we'll actually see something akin to Tiananmen Square once again. I'd just like to conclude by saying that the erosion of basic human rights that we're witnessing in Hong Kong, it's really the basic nature of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It's what they're all about. Look no further than Xinjiang, than Tibet. We've seen this time and time again, that the people under their yoke really have no freedoms at all. That's the vision of the Chinese Communist Party, not only there, but their vision for the way the rest of the world ought to be under their yoke. We must never let their vision triumph. I'm proud and happy and thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that today we are standing with the people of Hong Kong by enacting these measures, and I want to thank my colleagues for doing that, urge support of these, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Keating. No,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
As a co-sponsor of House Res 552, I'm deeply saddened but not surprised that we must call on the government of the Russian Federation to release U.S. resident Paul Whelan. It's nearly 9 months since Paul's arrest occurred on December 28th. The Russian government has refused to provide any evidence to substantiate the espionage charges against Paul. They continue to hold Paul in pretrial detention, consistently delaying his trial, subjecting him to physical and psychological pressure, denying him the ability to speak freely with U.S. embassy staff or receive some of the basic privileges to which Russian prisoners in the United States are entitled, such as the opportunity to speak with family members. The Russian government has consistently denied requests for Paul to be examined or treated by a private physician to address pre-existing health concerns. These concerns have been reiterated to the Russian government time and time again by the U.S. Embassy, as well as the embassies of the United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada, and all the countries of which Paul has citizenship. I've spoken frequently with Paul's sister Elizabeth, who's seen firsthand the pain and the anguish Paul's continued detention has caused, not only for him, but for the members of his family. I hope you'll support House Res 552 and join me in urging the government of Russia to provide the evidence against Paul, allow a fair and transparent judicial process without delay, facilitate Paul's medical care, and allow for unrestricted visits with the U.S. Embassy. The Russian government has not been able to provide evidence against Paul, and we must all stand with the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Canada in calling for Paul's immediate release. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Yoho. Not here? Oh, Mr. Wilson.
No. Hey, I yield to Mr. Yoho, but please keep me on the list.
You'll be next, Mr. Wilson.
Thank
I
you.
promise.
It's an honor to go ahead of Mr. Wilson. I appreciate it. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing this to happen, and Ranking Member McCall. These measures include H.Res. 543 by Representative Sherman, H.R. 3289 by Representative Smith, and H.R. 4270 by Representative McGovern, and I'm a proud co-sponsor of all three. Representative Sherman's resolution recognizes Hong Kong's bilateral relationship with the United States, condemns the interference of the People's Republic of China in Hong Kong affairs, and supports the people of Hong Kong's rights to protest. H.R. 4270, the Protect Hong Kong Act, prohibits the export of riot control equipment like tear gas to the Hong Kong police. This is in response to the continuing concerns regarding human rights abuses against Hong Kong demonstrators by the Hong Kong police. H.R. 3289, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, builds on the Hong Kong Policy Act, the cornerstone for our bilateral relationship, and allows the administration to re-examine our special relationship with Hong Kong and revoke privileges should the autonomy and freedoms of Hong Kong continue to erode. This bill applies sanctions to human rights abusers and ensures that visas are not blocked for pro-democracy protesters. Each of these measures demonstrates the United States' continued commitment to preserving the autonomy and freedom of the Hong Kong and its people, and we have witnessed the impact of these bills firsthand as pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong stood outside U.S. consulates waving U.S. flags and asking the U.S. government to help them. As members of Congress, we must continue to provide strength through unity to the Hong Kongers who are desperately protecting the freedoms and liberties they hold dear. Over the past 4 months, mass civilian protests in Hong Kong have begun to shed light on the deterioration of the Chinese Communist Party's suppression of freedom. Rising resentment in Hong Kong is not simply a result of the ill-fated extradition law championed by Chief Executive Carrie Lam, but now the continued encroachment on freedom and liberties by Emperor Xi Jinping and the CCP. Despite the 1997 British-Chinese agreement, leaders in Beijing continue to dishonor that agreement, and Hong Kong's autonomy continue to disappear. The protesters now maintain the 5 demands. We've heard them talked about today. The only one that has been removed was by Chief Executive Lam, and that was the extradition bill. In response to this continued unrest, the CCP, through acts of ignorance, has continued to cast blame on the United States and other democratic nations for interfering in Hong Kong's internal affairs and encouraging mass civil protests. In response to recent tweets by me and some of our colleagues, the Chinese foreign minister released a statement that said, "I cannot help asking the relevant senators and House representatives, are you lawmakers or are you lawbreakers? Hong Kong affairs are entirely China's internal affairs, and you are neither entitled nor qualified to comment on them. Mind your own business and stay out of Hong Kong affairs." The CCP will continue to blame Western nations for standing with the people of Hong Kong, as the party's biggest fear is freedom in their own backyard. It is not the U.S. to blame. The cause is simple. It's freedom and liberty. The people of Hong Kong have experienced these. They cherish them, and they don't want to lose them. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party don't understand liberty and freedom because they have neither experienced either one of them. I urge China to not make the same mistake they did 30 years ago in Tiananmen Square by bringing violence into the struggle. I stand with Hong Kong and will continue to support personal freedoms and democracy in Hong Kong, and I ask my colleagues to do the same and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member McCall for introducing House Res 517, supporting the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and its sixth replenishment. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee charged with protecting health and human rights across the globe, we have a responsibility to do everything within our power to shape a future in which no child, woman, or man dies from a preventable or treatable disease. The Global Fund puts us on the path to combat and ultimately eradicate the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria around the world. Since its creation in 2002, more than 27 million lives have been saved in countries where the Global Fund invests. Across the world, the fund has come to be seen as a model for developing effective partnerships between governments, the private sector, civil society, and affected communities to take on health epidemics. The Global Fund has contributed to extraordinary improvements in global health overall. It is the world's largest financier of treatment and prevention programs for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The fund has helped to reduce by half the number of AIDS-related deaths since 2005, contributed to a 37% decline in tuberculosis deaths from 2000 to 2016, and a 60% decline in the number of malaria deaths since 2000. Despite this progress, far too many people, including far too many children, lack access to the most basic healthcare services and medicine. That's why it is so essential that we pass House Res 517 with a resounding bipartisan vote. This resolution rightly commends the work of the Global Fund and its partners for their contributions in decreasing the prevalence of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, while also reaffirming Congress's support for the Global Fund by providing robust U.S. funding so that we can make greater progress. As we redouble our efforts to advance global health, we should also urge other donor countries to step up the fight against these diseases and increase their pledges for the Sixth Global Fund replenishment. And we should urge countries that receive support from the Global Fund to meet ambitious co-financing requirements to sustain the progress on ending these epidemics. I am proud to co-sponsor and vote in support of House Res 517, a resolution supporting the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and its sixth replenishment. I want to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for introducing this resolution, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes on H.Res 517. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wild. Now, Mr. Wilson, it's finally your turn.
Especially thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Elliott Engel and Republican Leader Michael McCall, for bringing these important measures before us today. I'm grateful for the bipartisan support this committee is showing today in support of the brave people of Hong Kong. For 16 consecutive weeks now, the world has witnessed the brave people of Hong Kong stand up and promote self-determination of their destiny from Beijing. The world deluded itself to believe that China would honor its pledge of one country, two systems after the British government handed over control of Hong Kong to China in 1997. But Hong Kong is a model of openness for the people of China. Hong Kong stands as a clear example to the average Chinese people that you can be both free and rich. It is a symbol of everything Americans hold dear. I appreciate so much President Donald Trump has courageously identified the democratic aspirations that are bursting under the chains of tyranny. My interest for the people of China is personal in that my father in 1944 served with the Flying Tigers in Chengdu, Xi'an, and Kunming, where he appreciated and supported the Chinese people resist aggression. I am grateful to be a co-sponsor of all three measures today that deal with Hong Kong. Thank you to our colleagues Brad Sherman, Chris Smith, and Jim McGovern for their hard work on the Hong Kong bills before us. This is a critical issue that requires strong and united leadership, and I am grateful that this committee is doing just that by marking up the measures today. Lastly, I'd like to express my strong support for Chairman Elliott Engel and Republican leaders Michael McCall's H Resolution 517, supporting the Global Fund. Since its inception in 2001, the Global Fund has raised nearly $50 billion in support of fighting AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. In 2018 alone, the Global Fund distributed 131 million mosquito nets to prevent malaria, treated 5.3 million people with TB, and provided medication to 18.9 million people living with HIV. 32 million lives have been saved thanks to the Global Fund since 2001. I'm grateful to stand with this committee in support of the life-saving work made possible by the Global Fund. I urge my colleagues to do as well. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and thank Ranking Member McCall for holding this markup today and for once again bringing up a bipartisan slate of important bills that will express this committee's support for peaceful protesters in Hong Kong, demonstrate our ongoing commitment to fighting TB, malaria, and AIDS through the Global Fund, hold authoritarian governments to account, and express our support for peace in the Central African Republic. I think these bills form a testament to our values as a committee, values that have historically been upheld through our foreign policy. I'm proud to co-sponsor H.Res 543, Mr. Sherman's resolution, recognizing the strong bilateral relationship between Hong Kong and the United States. Mr. Smith's bill, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and Mr. McGovern's bill to restrict the sale of certain crowd control items to the government of Hong Kong. For weeks, the people of Hong Kong have taken to the streets to protest the authoritarian actions of the Chinese government and its ever-increasing attempts to control Hong Kong. These brave protesters have persisted despite brutal actions on the part of the Hong Kong police and the ongoing threat of retaliation from mainland China. The people of Hong Kong deserve to determine their own future, and the United States must speak out against any government that uses aggressive and illegal tactics against peaceful protesters. I want to turn to H.Res 387, a bipartisan resolution I introduced with our colleague Jeff Fortenberry, supporting the peace process and the ongoing American development efforts in the Central African Republic. I want to thank the Better World Campaign and the UN Foundation for their leadership on issues related to CAR and for organizing the trip that I took along with members of Mr. Fortenberry's team so that we could see firsthand the challenges to maintaining peace in the country. I also want to thank Chairwoman Bass and Chairman Engel for their ongoing engagement on this issue. I was lucky enough to travel to CAR and know the promise and peril. I've met with the Central African leadership and worked with Mr. Fortenberry to craft legislation that lays out an important roadmap for the country to move beyond the current strife to find a lasting political solution to the conflict. I want to begin by highlighting the importance of peacekeeping in general and specifically within the country, as the UN peacekeeping missions there, MINUSCA, is playing a critical role in maintaining stability. Let me say at the outset that it is certainly my view that the UN peacekeeping is a vital tool at our disposal to keep civil wars from expanding into regional conflicts, reduce forced displacement, and prevent terrorists and criminals from establishing safe havens in places and countries where governance is weak. International peacekeeping efforts save the U.S. money and resources while protecting our national interests. This viewpoint is not mine alone. A 2018 U.S. Government Accountability Office report found that UN peacekeeping missions operate at 1/8 the cost of what it would take to deploy American troops alone. The U.S. military shares the same view about the value of peacekeeping. Lieutenant General Castlaw, who served over 30 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, backs up this report. He said, and I quote, "Having spent about a third of my career deployed outside the United States, I know that Americans aren't afraid to go in harm's way. But we can't be, and we shouldn't have to be, everywhere all the time. UN peacekeeping, like the mission I saw in CAR, helps ensure every country does its fair share to protect vulnerable populations and promote peace. It saves us money, but more importantly, it saves the lives of those we serve," end quote. I mentioned peacekeeping and Lieutenant General Castlaw because I traveled with him to the Central African Republic to see the work of the UN peacekeeping mission in that country up close. When I traveled with Lieutenant Castlaw in 2017, I witnessed firsthand the invaluable contributions of UN peacekeepers at preventing genocide. I saw peacekeepers protecting civilians and meeting with both Christian and Muslim communities to bring neighbors together and rebuild after conflict. I also met with President Tudera, a former mathematics professor who was committed to bringing peace not just to the capital of Bangui, but to the remote areas of Abo and beyond to bring peace dividends to those marginalized communities. I understand the challenges that the country still faces, including the lack of infrastructure, the difficulties of rebuilding the security sector, the need to end corruption, promoting good governance, and reforming the justice system to end cycles of violence and revenge. For now, more than 600,000 people remain exiled in squalid, poorly funded refugee camps, most in Cameroon, Chad, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And 464,000 more are dispersed across CAR, where 14 armed groups are vying for control. But there's also hope despite these ongoing challenges. For instance, the United Nations Refugee Agency said it has helped support the voluntary repatriation of around 1,500 refugees this year alone, while a further 14,000 have expressed willingness to be repatriated in the coming months thanks to improved security. In February of this year, the government signed an African Union-sponsored peace agreement with 14 armed groups that have controlled large swaths of territory in CAR. The peace agreement's aim is to decrease violence and include the voices of marginalized communities. These are definite signs of progress, but a bevy of challenges remain, which this legislation can help ameliorate. This bill highlights the U.S. commitment to the people of the Central African Republic and supporting a democratic government in their efforts to make a lasting peace for the country and the region. It calls for continued U.S. support for UN peacekeeping operations. It recognizes the progress that has been made and lays out opportunities for tackling the challenges that remain. It's my hope that the strong showing of support for this resolution will help keep progress moving and demonstrate the ongoing commitment of the United States government to achieving peace in the Central African Republic. With that, I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Is there anyone else on the Republican side seeking recognition? Okay, then we'll go to Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Ranking Member McCall. These measures, all 7, are useful steps toward addressing challenges and capitalizing on opportunities around the world today. All will improve our country's standing, strengthen our security, and ensure the United States remains a champion of liberty and justice for all in our foreign policy. I'm proud to support passage for each of them and will highlight a few specifically. Before us are 3 measures responding to the situation in Hong Kong that reaffirm American commitment to universal liberties. Just as the United States must be earnest in promoting common cause on fundamental values, we must also call out abuses. These items from my colleagues on this committee make clear that the United States will stand up for basic rights and do its part to stop persecution. The United States has a moral responsibility to call out misbehavior and not turn a blind eye to wrongdoing around the world. That's why I support these urgent and timely actions. When citizens took to the streets to register their opposition to a proposed extradition bill that would have flagrantly undermined the rule of law, they were defending their vital, semi-autonomous status under the one country, two systems framework established in 1997. As those in Hong Kong continue to exercise civil disobedience, they deserve protection. Violence by any party is unacceptable. A testament to the success of universal rights and protections, the United States is the greatest example of self-determination for freedom-loving people the world over. As proud Americans, we should not compromise our values nor censor criticism, especially to appease anti-democratic authoritarians, not today and not ever. Amid reports of Chinese Communist Party disinformation campaigns and the buildup of military personnel on the mainland, we must clearly condemn efforts to silence the voice of the people. 30 years removed from Tiananmen Square, the international community still remembers and watches vigilantly today. I stand in solidarity with peaceful supporters of freedom. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. Mr. Levin.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I want to thank you, Chairman Engel, as well as Ranking Member McCall for this package of bills, and I want to speak particularly on H.Res. 552, which calls on the Russian government to provide evidence of wrongdoing or to release United States citizen Paul Whelan. Mr. Whelan is a Michigander from the district of my friend and neighboring Congresswoman Haley Stevens. He was arrested in Russia in December of last year and has been held without trial in a Russian prison. The Russian government has presented zero evidence that Paul committed a crime, and yet he remains in prison, denied due process, and now he's in very poor health. We must bring Paul Whelan home. I hope this resolution sends a clear message to the Russian government, and I hope it assures his brave family that we are absolutely committed to getting Paul back to Michigan safely and soon. I strongly urge everyone on this committee to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Oh, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say a couple of things about the Hong Kong bills. I'm very, very glad that we are moving them forward on a bipartisan basis. The Hong Kong people's struggle for democracy and human rights is their struggle, theirs alone, led by them, but it also clearly implicates America's national interest. This is about a promise that the Chinese Communist Party made, not just to the people of Hong Kong, but to all of us, including the United States, that Hong Kong's autonomy as a rule of law environment would be maintained. That promise is being violated, and I think it's extremely important that we communicate clearly to the Chinese government that these promises need to be kept. And I can say from my own experience as a former diplomat, having dealt with the Chinese, that they are very, very concerned about international opinion. Their frantic efforts to persuade us not to pass resolutions like this, not to make statements like this, are a testament to their sensitivity and their concern about what the international community may think. I also want to add that I do hope, as we rightly speak out about the events in Hong Kong, that we also move as quickly as possible to address another human rights situation in China, the situation involving the Uyghur people. As awful as Chinese influenced repression in Hong Kong has been, it pales in comparison to what is probably the single greatest abuse of human rights in the world today, the detention of up to 10% of the Uyghur population, an attempt to essentially eradicate a people and a culture. We have legislation in the House that is frankly, it's good. I would even want it to be stronger. I believe we absolutely do need to mandate sanctions against those responsible in China for these terrible abuses, and to wrestle more than we have with the question of complicity by American and multinational companies in China's instruments of oppression, its surveillance state, its labor abuses in Xinjiang, and so forth. So I hope that we will come soon to a point where this committee can come together around some strong measures to deal with the situation in Xinjiang as well. Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Anyone else seeking recognition? Okay, hearing no further requests for recognition, then without objection, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. Without objection, each measure is considered as read, and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. The question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended, if amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to, and without objection, each measure is ordered favorably reported as amended, if amended, and any amendment to a bill shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. And this concludes our business today. I want to once again thank Ranking Member McCall and all of the committee members for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.